I'm going to give a kind of schizophrenic talk because I want to talk about private communication, but I've also been thinking a lot about American action movies. And judging from the selection available in my hotel room, it seems that American action movies are available in this country and quite popular. So I wanted to take this opportunity to talk about them because I've been thinking about them. And I've been thinking mostly about the American action movie as a reflection of the American social narrative. Basically, the things that we're all thinking about. How do we perceive the world? What are the ideas that we all sort of collectively have in common? And so what I did was I went back in time and I looked at the IMDb movie ratings for every American action movie from like the 1980s until present. And I looked at the highest grossing films. So if you start in the 1980s, this is, like the movies of my childhood, right? First, 1983 or 1984, Red Dawn. This is a film about a Soviet invasion of the United States, where the opening scene is these like Soviet paratroopers parachuting out of planes onto the high school football field of like a Midwest American high school. And this small band of high school students manages to escape the invasion, flee to the hills where they wage guerrilla warfare against the Soviet invasion. I used to like sit in my middle school math class every day, staring out the window, hoping to see Russian paratroopers, parachuting down. Anything would have been better, right? 1985, Top Gun. Again, canonical 80s American action film. This is about American fighter pilots. There's this sort of interpersonal drama, but really the larger narrative of the movie is the conflict between the Soviet and the American fighter pilots. Excellent film. 1986, Rocky IV. This is, I think, the best of the Rocky movies. In this version of Rocky, Rocky boxes the Soviet boxer. And the Soviet boxer is like the product of Russian engineering. Oh, you're saying the actual actor is Swedish. Wow, you guys are quick to correct me on that. But as the story goes, he was a Soviet, Soviet boxer. He's like the product of Russian science. There's all the training scenes, and he has all the stuff hooked up to his body. They're like injecting stuff into his arms. The scientists are all around him. They're measuring things on machines. Rocky, on the other hand, is just like some guy, right? And he trains by like running through the snow, and he actually saws logs as part of his like strength training, 1989, Hunt for Red October, another amazing canonical 80s action movie. This one, Sean Connery is the captain of a Soviet submarine. He's actually defecting, but the drama is that, the American military doesn't know what's going on. This submarine that he's in is the super advanced submarine that is undetectable by, normal means. So if you look at all of the really high-grossing 80s action films throughout the decade, they're all about the Cold War, right? Every single one of them. And what's amazing about this decade is that the Soviet them is like perfect. It's this really sort of powerful them. And if you can create a really powerful them, it implies an us. If you've got a them, you've got to have an us. Right? And the thing about them is like what was so great about them is they were like not human. They were these sort of monsters, right? You look at the boxer in Rocky, he's not a person. He's like a product of engineering, If you look at the fighter pilots in any of the Top Gun scenes, whenever they depict the American fighter pilots, you can always see their eyes. Whenever they show the Soviet fighter pilots, they're just faceless. They're just these like, machines, these non-existent monsters, right? And the Americans are always the underdog. You know, like the MiGs in the Top Gun scene are superior to the American airplanes. You know, the Russian submarine in Hunt for Red October is undetectable. You know, if you look at Rocky, you know, he's like a foot smaller than this guy. He's like tiny, you know. We're always the underdogs. You know, they always have superior technology, but we have heart. You know, that's how, you know, we prevail every time. Now, the thing about creating a really powerful them and defining an us is that it makes it very difficult to be at all critical of us. You know, any kind of critique about us must mean that you're one of them. You know, if you do engage in any kind of internal critique, that means you're not one of us, you must be one of them, you know. And that was, I think, what was so powerful about that narrative in the 1980s. Then if you start looking at the action films of the 1990s, what's amazing is that post-91, fall of the Soviet Union, there's nothing. There's not a single high-grossing action film for the first half of the 1990s. It's like the film writers just didn't know what to do. You know, like they had this perfect story, and they could just churn them out, you know, and like they knew it so well, and then post-91, they were just totally lost. There's not a single high-grossing action film for the first half of the decade. And then something very interesting happens. In 1995, Braveheart. This is the story of a Scottish commoner who is rebelling against his own oppressive government. Also in 1995, Hackers comes out, ostensibly an action film. This is the story of you know, these innocent hackers who are persecuted by both large corporations and the US federal government. Their only crime was curiosity. 1998, this Will Smith movie comes out, Enemy of the State. The interesting thing about this film is that like the villain in this film was the NSA. It was the NSA in 1998. You know, is the story of this large government agency that had gone out of control. It lost its focus and had turned it inwards, you know, on its own citizens. Also in 1999, The Matrix, also sort of the story of, you know, people fighting in rebellion against their own oppressive environment. In 1999 as well, this sort of cult film that was actually really high-grossing, Worldwide Battle Royale. It's a Japanese film about these students who are basically fighting against this older generation who put them into this sort of Hunger Games-like situation. It's basically the original Hunger Games. And then in 2000, the first of the Bourne series, Bourne Identity movies. Again, this is a story about a government agency that has gotten too large, lost its focus, gone out of control, and is focusing inward against its own people. So if you look at all of the high-grossing films of the 1990s, there's really no clear them. You know, it's not like the 1980s where you could define this them and an us. Instead, it's really stories of power versus people, over and over again. Then, of course, the 2000s, 2001, everything changes. And the first half of the 2000s, all of the films are really about terrorism. And what's interesting is that it didn't work at first. Like if you look at sort of the attempts at action films in the early 2000s, post-2001, they're all this sort of confused story about, you know, there's this guy, we capture him, there's a bomb hidden somewhere in the city, do we torture him? I don't know, what a dilemma. And it wasn't really that compelling. And then in the sort of mid-half of the decade, it really starts to catch on in the form of narrative. The form of metaphor. So, you know, all of the sort of Marvel Comics series movies really play this out in a way that people really engaged with. You know, the original Batman film is that story, right? You know, you have this sort of, you know, world where there's this sort of, everyone is sort of vaguely corrupt or nepotistic, sort of unworthy, you know, corrupted people. There's this group of bad people who destroy civilizations. It's not clear why, that's just what they do. And then there's this virtuous few, you know, who are actually righteous, and they save all of us, even though we don't even deserve it. You know, it's almost a fascist message. You know, Transformers film, same thing. All of the X-Men stuff, same thing. The worst offender is the original Captain America movie. I mean, this is just terrible. And I think it all culminates in 2009 with this film Taken, which I think is really representative of that entire decade. They do it perfectly where, there's this sort of vaguely Eastern European bad people who are just bad. And, they kidnap two 16-year-old American girls from affluent neighborhood in Paris. Nobody is safe. And who saves the day? The CIA agent from the 1980s who we all thought, was obsolete. So in the early, 2000s, it's all about the terrorist them. And again, a them implies an us. So if you, graph all of this out on this really terrible timeline, you get these clear, series of narrative over a few decades, right? Cold War, power versus people, terrorism. And the reason I think that this is kind of interesting is because when I think of the hacker community or the hacker scene, to me, that really sort of ignited or came together and really became a force in about 1995, which is right in the middle of this decade of power versus people. And so I think, in a sense, that narrative is sort of baked into us, that it's sort of a part of our DNA, that it's our origin story and where we come from. And so here we are, at the beginning of a new decade, right? This decade of terrorism is kind of coming to an end in terms of, narrative, at least reflection in action films. And if you look at the action films that have started to emerge in this decade, they're things like Hunger Games or, this recent film Elysium. And both of these are, again, somewhat stories of power versus people. So I think, in looking forward into the rest of this decade, what are the action movies of this decade going to be and how will they reflect our social narrative? I think it's looking somewhat like a return to power versus people again.